the Associate Director for International Media Relations right now for the Office of Public Affairs here at Notre Dame. And so I want to give you that title as well. Okay, so I am very honored to introduce this distinguished panel of experts on NAFTA and the new US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that will replace NAFTA. And what's really great about this panel is each person has a very distinct
Welcome, Mike.
view.
The guy's trying to sneak in. You got to do that.
And you can tell we want this to be very informal and a good discussion. So, but they all each have a very distinct perspective, and so I think this is going to be great because we're going to get to hear all sort of like USMCA 360. And so let me start. I'm going to go alphabetically. I'm going to start with Jeff Bergstrand, who many of you know from Kellogg. He's been a finance professor at Mendoza College of Business for more than 30 years, and a fellow here at the Kellogg Institute, and also a research associate of CESIFO, an international network of researchers based in Europe. His research on international trade flows, free trade agreements, foreign direct investment, multinational firms, and exchange rates has been published in more than 50 articles in such journals as the American Economic Review and as chapters in books. Jeff also served as co-editor of the Review of International Economics from 1996 to 2003 and remains on its editorial board. He is currently revising a paper entitled Putting Canada in the Penalty Box, Trade and Welfare Effects of Eliminating NAFTA for an economics journal. So he's in the thick of it right now. Next to Jeff is the Honorable Antonio Garza, Tony as we call him. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Mexico from 2002 to 2009. He's a businessman and attorney and is considered an expert on U.S.-Mexico relations and the business and political environments of both nations, particularly in Mexico's energy sector. Ambassador Garza is a director of the American Society Council of the Americas and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's a recipient of the Aztec Eagle, the Mexican government's highest award for a foreigner. Before being ambassador, he was chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission, which we have to say is what regulates the energy sector in Texas. So oil guy, even though it says Railroad Commission. He served as Secretary of State for Texas under Governor George W. Bush. And he was a county judge. He currently serves as counsel in Mexico City for White & Case LLP. And it says Via Novo, but okay. And then finally, we have Tamara Kay, Associate Professor of Global Affairs at Keough. And also, she also has an appointment in the Department of Sociology. Her research and teaching focus is on political and legal implications of regional economic integration, transnationalism, and global governance for labor and environmental movements, NGOs, and policy formation. She earned a PhD from UC Berkeley, spent 2 years as a postdoc at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego. She began her academic career at Harvard, where she was Associate Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Transnational Studies Initiative. She's the author of the prize-winning book, NAFTA and the Politics of Labor Transnationalism, and the co-author of Trade Battles, Activism and Politicization of International Trade Policy. So we are going to start out, again, going alphabetically. Each of our panelists is just going to give you a quick 5-minute prepared comments on basically what they want you to know about this new agreement. We'll start with Jeff.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks for the opportunity to be here on this panel and for coming out today on this lovely afternoon. As Kathy mentioned, so I'm an international trade economist, so I tend to look at things, the perspective I'm going to give is somebody that studied a lot of free trade agreements. NAFTA is just one of many that are out there, and a student of international trade flows and to some extent foreign direct investment. I just want to make, I'm going to use my prepared time just to deliver 5 what I think are really important points about this debate, keeping in mind that there's many students here. The first thing is that, so this is titled NAFTA versus USMCA. And while USMCA is on the horizon, that the U.S. International Trade Commission will, in a couple of weeks, will come out with the first economic analysis of USMCA. But there have been statements made by the president that if this does not pass, that maybe NAFTA will be eliminated. The president has the right to give 6 months notice on the termination of the agreement. So the first point I want to make is that NAFTA is very important to the U.S. economy. In 2017, in terms of U.S. exports, just to get a perspective on the size of the importance of this agreement, is U.S. exports overall in a given year is about $1.5 trillion. That's about 8% of the size of our economy, so about $1.5 trillion. Well, the trade with 1/3 of U.S. export, this is their total exports, 225 countries in the world, 1/3 of those exports are just with Canada and Mexico, okay, come within the bounds of the NAFTA agreement. Imports, we actually import more than we export. So probably most people here are aware that we have a big U.S. trade deficit. We import in total about $2.2 trillion. So actually our deficit is about 1/3 of our overall size of imports. But our imports, just slightly under 1/3 of those imports, come again just from Canada and Mexico under the framework of NAFTA. So trade with these countries are very important. If, as I mentioned at the outset, a second point I want to make is if USMCA does not pass Congress, as well as it has to be not only passed by our Congress, has to be passed by the legislatures in Mexico and in Canada as well. And I think those are coming on down the road around June, I've heard, for those two. That, it's possible that NAFTA could be eliminated. And to give you, from an economist viewpoint, there's a lot of it, very difficult to estimate counterfactuals. If, for example, a counterfactual would be NAFTA is about 25 years old. What would our economies look like without NAFTA? That's a very strong counterfactual. When you think about a counterfactual, it's like, what if I didn't get married 40 years ago to my wife? Okay, what would my life look like? This is very difficult to project. But there are models that try to structure those things. And no talking about my wife. Using data to estimate the impacts on bilateral trade with Canada and Mexico, and then economists use computer simulation. This is a well-established methodology that's evolved over like 70 years' time. That with these two co-authors, Kathy mentioned about a paper I'm working on. What I've done is to simulate using well-accepted economic models, simulated what would be the trade, bilateral trade impacts, what would be the standard of living impacts for our 3 countries if NAFTA was eliminated. And basically one of the estimates we found is in the United States, the largest economy of the 3, our standards of living over the next 10 years would only fall by 1/4%. So we think our standard of living is about $60,000 for an average person in the United States. That would erode by 1/4% over the next 10 years, which is not huge, but actually that's well within the norms for the effects of these agreements, which are not huge, and I'll talk more about that later as conversation arises. But Mexico's smaller, Canada's smaller, and the estimates are the typical Mexican consumer standard of living would fall by about 1%. And we found why I titled it this way, putting Canada in the penalty box. Canada's standard of living falls by about 2%. Okay, so the bottom line there, the second important point I wanted to make is that these are very representative results, which is that standards of living will fall in all 3 countries by eliminating NAFTA. And this is kind of consistent with a lot of the growth of regionalism and free trade agreements in the last 30 years has led to rises in countries' standards of living. The differences in size very quickly. The third point is the US is huge. So if you do eliminate NAFTA, most of our trade is with ourselves. it's international. About 92% of our trade is with ourselves. Okay, so if you eliminate NAFTA, we'll have more international trade as we close off our markets, but the percentage change is very small. That's why you don't get a huge fall in standard of living for a very large country. But Mexico and Canada trade with the outside world and trade with the United States and the other partners is larger. So they tend to, when you collapse trade, they're doing more international trade. They're hurt relatively more because of their smaller size. In the case of Canada, where our study is unique, is because we actually measure international trade costs, which are very high for Canada because it's a spacious economy relative to its size. The last 2 points I'll make and then pass on to my colleagues here. These are static estimates. These are lower bounds. When we talk about these things, it doesn't take into account that even in recent time, you can think about it. We're experiencing a lot of uncertainty about trade. You take the US-China trade wars, you take NAFTA, you take the decision to not pass the TPP. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty there, and there's a retrenchment of economic activity. And so likely the damaging effects from not having these types of agreement and not passing USMCA are likely larger, but very hard to quantify with that uncertainty and reduced investment. And the last point I want to make is that immigration and trade tend to be substitutes. NAFTA has broadened trade, deepened trade and ties between our countries in many ways that we'll probably talk about. Because we've enhanced trade, there's less need for factors to move. There's less need for immigration. If there's not NAFTA, or there's not USMCA, there's going to be less trade, okay? And that means immigration will actually rise, which we know is a very politically sensitive issue. And that's something also to kind of think about. So I'll stop there.
So you want to give some opening remarks?
Well, yeah, some general opening remarks. One thing I think Jeff did a very good job in sort of framing the economics, and it's one of these kind of discussions when people are talking about trade agreements in settings like this, where you have somebody who can lay out the case for trade and the economic benefits of it. You're almost left wondering, well, if it's so good, why don't people like it? And I think that's kind of the environment that we find ourselves in, that we've seen really probably well before Brexit. People were already concerned or expressed the sense of anti-globalization and a little bit of nationalism on the rise and some forms of populism. And I think it's particularly concerning in the context of NAFTA for somebody that looks at themselves as, grew up in the United States, live in Mexico, trade with Canada, and you see this kind of platform, which seems like a fairly natural one, given in many respects how our economies are somewhat complementary, and they have managed to come together and integrate in a way that I think has been generally very good for all three countries. Certainly there's some real deficiencies, there's some challenges, and the agreement was definitely in need of updating, but I'm not sure that's what we did this last cycle. What we essentially did was try to salvage an agreement, because in the United States, we had an election in 2016, and you had a presidential candidate, now the 45th president of the United States, that had run a somewhat populist anti-trade campaign and aimed a fair amount of fire at Mexico. And while those were all proved to be politically pretty successful, they did create a series of promises that he then felt the need to keep, and one of them was the renegotiation of NAFTA. And I think that was kind of consistent with what was going on around the world, really. In the EU and other countries, you were moving towards populism, not necessarily embracing trade. Some real legitimate concerns about wage disparity and the distribution of income and these sorts of things. So that was real. In Mexico, you have also had an election cycle that brought in a very different kind of president, kind of a leftist. You saw the collapse of the two traditional parties in Mexico, and this populist that also, while not anti-trade, not a huge free trader. And in Canada, you had Trudeau, who I think wanted to do some things with respect to labor and environment consistent with where he was politically. So you had three leaders, you had the old administration in Mexico transitioning into a new one, who in my mind are not really fundamentally committed free traders. I think of the three, Trudeau is probably the closest to a free trader. The other two are kind of reluctant go-alongers with free trade because I think they probably recognize the economic arguments, but they're trying to accommodate political realities within their countries. And so that's the environment that we find ourselves in right now. And I think really going forward, it's not so much the economic arguments that are going to carry the day. They're just going to be certain brutal political trade-offs that have to be made in each of these three countries. Because, look, at the end of a negotiation last year, when they finally got to the end of the negotiated part of the process, normally at the end of something that should be so good, it would be a celebratory kind of thing. At the end of this negotiation, there was largely simply relief that they had gotten to the end of the process, and now they could kick it over to the congressional, the legislature in each of the three countries. I think you'll probably see a relatively straightforward path legislatively in Mexico. In Canada, I think it will be more challenging and unlikely to happen before their elections in October, kick it onto the other side. In the United States, I'm really concerned because we have a less trade-focused Congress, perhaps, than we ever have. The original NAFTA, we had a Democratic president, Clinton, largely Republican Congress, and the votes were cobbled together, and it was still a close vote. I think we have an environment now that is probably less pro-trade than it has been in some time, and that's consistent with where we are like politically as a country. Yet at the same time, there has probably never been a moment when we more needed to continue to integrate our platform in North America in order to be competitive with other parts of the world. So we're really going into a very interesting moment where selling trade is going to be very challenging. Jeff, at the end of his statement, started to talk about immigration. And sometimes I think trade, immigration, they get kind of conflated in people's minds, and you will have political opposition that'll form, that'll be anti-trade and anti-immigration when you say, well, just pick one. Because maybe if you're more pro-trade, you see less of the pressures on immigration, or maybe if you were, you can't be against these sorts of things, but they're kind of conflated generally as I'm just anti-globalism. Quite frankly, on a more visceral level, I'm just anti-other. And then you get down to the real kind of identity politics that is what I think is at the core, the nationalism or the identity politics that is a real challenge, not only in our country, but I think in a lot of countries around the world. So that's just sort of the opening. I'm the political hack on the panel. So I tend to see things through that political prism. As Kathy pointed out, that's kind of been the environment. She was nice enough not to point out that I also went to the University of Texas, which has a football team. Has one. Okay? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But anyway, that's sort of the way I'd frame it, just for openers.
Great. Tamara?
All right, strap in, everybody. Buckle up, because I love talking about trade. What I want you to get out of my introduction is I want to make sure everybody understands. So I'm going to sort of take the macro, Jeff sort of the economics of this, and Tony sort of politics of this, and kind of help you understand it from a historical perspective, which relates to what's happening now as we're going through the negotiation, why, and you asked the question, why people hate trade. And I think probably, so what I want you to understand is why it matters for you. I will tell you things you probably don't know exist in trade, and you will see very quickly why a huge anti-globalization movement took place around the negotiation of the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade and NAFTA simultaneously in the early 1990s. Okay, so that's my goal, for you to really understand why this was so contentious and what it means going forward. Okay, So prior to NAFTA and the GATT being negotiated in the early 1990s, trade and trade agreements were generally about the macro issues Jeff mentioned. Tariffs, or taxes on products crossing borders, subsidies, quotas, okay? That's what trade was about. And most organizations like labor unions were pro-trade, right? If you were an auto worker, you actually wanted to be able to make more cars, make more money, and to do that, you had to sell them in Europe, sell them in Asia, right? So unions were pro-trade. What we started to see in the late 1980s was that there were these corporations that were actually trying to get through the US Congress rules, provisions, that would give them more rights and freedoms to do certain things that Congress was pushing back on, right? So we had laws protecting endangered species, and corporations were trying to go through Congress to try to undermine these rules, to undermine patent rules, have huge extensions on medical patents and medications, and they were actually getting tremendous pushback in the US Congress. They couldn't do it through the US Congress. They realized that actually, they could actually tack these things on to trade agreements, okay? And so they started to put these into trade agreements. And so what the image I want you to think about now is imagine a huge Trojan horse, okay? That's free trade. And then imagine all the little minions inside the horse as all the provisions that basically what they do for the first time in history is they start to undermine the ability of governments to regulate for the public good, right? What do I mean by that? Basically, you want to have a law that allows, there was a big case about tuna fishing. So the US has had a law, wanted to protect salmon, tuna caught in dolphin nets, protect dolphins from these fisheries, and basically the GATT rule said you can't do that, right? And so we had over and over and over again these provisions that prevented the governments, all the governments who were involved in these trade agreements, from basically legislating for the public good. And then we had in NAFTA something called the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanisms, the ISDS mechanisms. And these were basically private secret courts that allowed corporations to sue governments when they passed laws in the public good. And I can give you a couple examples of cases, like when Egypt tried to increase its minimum wage and basically got sued in one of these investor state courts because it affected their future profits, right? A case where California decided to get rid of a cancer-causing chemical in its gasoline, and a Canadian company that produces that chemical sued the US and said, you're affecting our future profits by basically creating health, consumer protection rights, all kinds of food, all kinds of labor, environmental protections. You're basically undermining our right for future profits. So this went way beyond kind of eminent domain claims that companies had used in the past when the governments actually took their property, right? This was something miles above that, okay? So what ends up happening now is we see the politics, right? Because now trade, and we now call these things free trade agreements, they end up becoming more political than economic, I would argue, right? They still have an economic purpose, but they spark this incredible political pushback because the activists, the labor movement, the consumer rights movement, health, immigrant rights, indigenous rights, farmers, all recognize that all of these laws that we want to create in the public good to regulate the environment, our clean air, our clean water, can now be undermined through these trade agreements, okay? So they start to push back, and that starts this massive movement against free trade agreements. They did not win this battle with NAFTA. They won it in other places. I would argue they won it with the TPP. And what we're seeing now is the irony is that we now have a Republican president, right, who is actually the anti-trade, the anti-NAFTA person, even though it's been the progressive organizations that have been fighting against these kinds of provisions, these Trojan horse provisions in trade agreements for the last 25 years. And so we're seeing this incredibly fascinating, interesting political situation where now all these organizations actually, I would argue, have a better agreement. We're going to talk about that. And yet it's being proposed by a Republican president who mixes his anti-NAFTA, anti-trade message with his virulent, racist, anti-immigration, anti-Mexico rhetoric. Okay? So that is actually what's at stake here. What's at stake here is, you know, what are these organizations going to do? Are they going to push for, and there's still problems with the agreement, but are they going to push and accept? Or at this point, are the politics such that, you know, we're thinking about the 2020 elections, we don't give Trump a win on anything, right? So this is why I want you all to be excited. This is just fascinating. It's incredibly, incredibly important. And it affects, again, things that you probably didn't think it affected in your life. We used to have legislation in the US that actually forced meat producers in the US to label where the beef came from. Where's the beef? I'll tell you where the beef is from. It's from Canada, it's from Mexico, right? And the Mexicans and Canadians actually put one of these ISDS mechanisms through the World Trade Organization, and our US Congress got rid of the law because we were facing tremendous trade sanctions if we didn't basically get rid of this law. So it affects all of us. Okay, let's get into it.
Okay, so moving forward, I'm going to throw out a general question, and actually I would like to see more of a discussion among our experts. Did we give you a mechanism to write down questions? Do you have cards to ask questions, or no? Okay, well then we're just going to raise hands, okay? So I think we can let's start talking, but if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand and we can take them. Should we start with the audience? Okay, all right, go ahead first.
So first, let me very quickly, I totally, absolutely agree with Tamara. I am surprised that we still pose free trade agreements about trade. I think by now we know that they are about much more, including and particularly property rights and intellectual property rights than anything else. So a couple of questions to the whole panel. The first is, and connected to some of the comments, can one be anti-free trade agreement but pro-regulated globalization? And should we move away from the debate of you are either pro-free trade and therefore you take the full package, or you are anti-nationalist? And then the second question, which was a little bit more for Tamara, but for everyone, is given how little we like free trade agreements, some of us like free trade agreements precisely because of the issue of policy space. Should we, but given also that this is about a marriage and that there's 30 years or 20 years of independence, should we actually be in favor or rooting to eliminate NAFTA altogether, or should we propose and use this opportunity to try to change that?
So first question, who'd like to take on the
Well, I mean, I can take a shot at it in a very general sense. That I guess I don't want to say that it's an either or. I think the discussion and negotiation around free trade agreements is the mechanism by which we can have quote unquote regulated trade. There are provisions of free trade agreements that address a whole host of things. And so I think that whether it's initially GATT, WTO, bilateral agreements, in this case a trilateral agreement, that is the framework from within which you're going to have these sorts of discussions. So I would start with that. And within them, you do have the capacity to regulate. I don't know that well, I do know that I likely disagree with some of what Tamara said, because I didn't make the jump between the trade agreement and undermining the regulatory framework within the United States. Because I think that through our domestic process, we have the ability to regulate quite heavily and quite effectively, whether it's clean air or the issues of property rights or the extension of patents or the protection of intellectual property. We have that. And in many cases, in other countries, by virtue of entering into a free trade agreement, while their standards may not be elevated to the level of what we have in the United States, there is an upping of the standard generally. And by virtue of U.S. business involvement in those countries, whether it is as explicit as legal, there are now pressures for them to do things correctly or more properly in those markets because they're subject to kind of the reputational and political pressures of the marketplace. So you do see that. But I do think the mechanism generally is going to be trade agreements. I mean, there is something fundamental about, help me out here, but this, the comparative advantage that nations enjoy. And I think trading is ultimately about elevating the standards of living for people in all countries. So I think this is generally the mechanism. What you put in there or don't have in there is how you get at the regulation that you're talking about. But I think this is the mechanism.
So, Jeff.
Yeah. So I want to start from like a first principle, which is that, and Tony kind of gave me a springboard, the notion of comparative advantage. Let me state it this way. There is nothing inherently special about international trade in the following sense, that all of us, I mean, I specialize, I've acquired a comparative advantage in studying trade flows, in studying free trade agreements and understanding that. And that gives me human capital, which I can share to the domestic market, I can share to the international market, okay? So all international trade is talking at the national level about those comparative advantages, but it's no different than an individual trying to leverage that specialty, and that there's a taste for that variety of knowledge and all that. And we're all unique and we all bring differentiated knowledge that raises our standard of living through that inherent notion. In terms of free trade agreements, I'll come back to some of the issues that Tamara raised. I mean, really started with the GATT. Tamara mentioned the GATT. The GATT started General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was not a organization like the IMF or World Bank after World War II. It did not form, it was stillborn. It was just an agreement, but it laid a foundation for countries to come back together after World War II. The GATT, alongside those other organizations, helped to bring the world together in terms of exchange. And that also leverages towards a political stability. We've had this world economic order that, while yes, many people, we can talk about this, many people have been hurt in terms of stagnant real incomes. On average, incomes have grown. On average, political stability has widened. On average, we have not had World War III, partly because of the growth of that. The free trade agreements and the proliferation of that is partly because the GATT, once you got to 150 members of the World Trade Organization in the early 90s, couldn't go, it's hard to negotiate among 150 members. So there's a splintering out. And just like, you know, in a family, people splinter out in terms of, you know, things that they can do, although they work together. The free trade agreements give an opportunity for groups that are closer to kind of work together and further enhance those things. So I think it's a natural outgrowth alongside with technological changes that have enhanced and augmented world trade and raised many countries. I mean, most countries have gotten out of poverty that were in poverty through engaging the world system, promoting an export-led economic growth. We think of the 4 Asian tigers. We think about China. We think about Singapore. I think that's all been very favorable. Now, some interesting questions, which is, to what extent do these free trade agreements get too deep in terms of impinging upon national laws, national sovereignty? I think this is the really interesting question. For example, one thing that kind of comes to my mind in terms of USMCA is that in terms of labor provision. Now in the USMCA, there's 22 chapters in NAFTA. There's 34 chapters in USMCA. One of them, which was under NAFTA, the labor, trying to meet certain labor standards and commonalities there, was a side agreement. Now that is part of USMCA. So that is one area where I think USMCA is an improvement upon NAFTA, and trying to bring to the fore some of these concerns. And one thing is, for example, promoting right to work and unionization in Mexico is now part of the USMCA agreement. But that actually, you know, we can ask, I mean, to what extent that we in the United States want that. We would like countries around the world to enhance their standard of living through that. But to what extent should a free trade agreement kind of impose kind of our will upon some of these other countries? I think these are really interesting questions that which I think spills over to what Tamara was saying, that these free trade agreements are going beyond just tariffs and liberalization. They maintain it. One of the great things about USMCA is basically all the tariffs that were zeroed out and close to zero in NAFTA just carry over into USMCA. And we can talk later about basically a tweaking of NAFTA 1.0 in that regard. But a lot of these free trade agreements are getting into these deeper issues that we have to kind of question. What are the limits of it? And I think some of this we're seeing now with Brexit, and we're seeing with the tensions within the EU, which is a much, much deeper agreement. Does it go too far in terms of impinging upon national sovereignty?
And I would say that a lot of the benefits of trade, and Jeff has done some interesting research on the relationship between trade and peace, they could be accomplished with trade and not with the Trojan horse, right? You see the difference? So all those benefits could come from lowering tariffs. So we're at a point, you know, historically, we're post-World War II, tariffs, you know, 2.5%, right? That's probably, well, depending on what the current president does, not going to change. Even if we got rid of NAFTA, we go to probably somewhere between 2 and 4 percentage tariff rates, right? So I think this question that you ask, you know, a lot of what we actually think of as trade is not actually trade. It's all the minions inside the horse. And they're big, and what I was saying to you, Tony, is that there are really serious consequences to these provisions, right? So we got rid of consumer safety, food safety laws because of the ISDS that was filed. In El Salvador, the government decided to close down a mine. Actually, it was a license to the mine. I don't think the mine had even opened yet. And the Canadian mining company sued El Salvador and said, we haven't even opened the mine yet, but you're impinging on our future profits. Should we open the mine? Is that what we want? Right? Those are really serious. That's really serious policy implications. That's serious policy implications for people who are really poor all over the world, especially when we look at the pharmaceutical industry, when we look at people who need cancer drugs around the world in developing countries, people who have HIV/AIDS and need drugs and medicine all over the world. There's serious consequences. And I think that raises the issue that you just brought up at the end of your discussion, Jeff, which is part of the problem with free trade agreements, not free trade. So I'm not opposed to, you know, dealing with tariffs and dealing with subsidies and dealing with quotas. Part of the problem is that there's no floor. What is the floor? So you talk about, well, should we be imposing these things on other countries? 500, 600 corporations negotiated NAFTA. In terms of the folks who represent all of us, 10, 15 were represented in the original NAFTA negotiation on the ACPIN committee, which is the advisory committee. And so, you know, basically these trade agreements are basically made for corporations. And we have to really, really think about that. What is the floor going to be? And what I would argue is that we should have a floor that takes into consideration human dignity and human decency, right? So we shouldn't actually be creating a situation where we create a immiseration in Mexico, but wait, but we create a immiseration in Mexico simply because we want cheap consumer goods.
But I understand what you're saying about Trojan horses and trade agreements should be about, I agree, it should be about the elimination of tariffs. And then you go off in a direction, which I think is true, that a lot goes into trade agreements that have less to do with trade. And the corporate whomever is getting what they want, and that we should have established a floor of decency and dignity, which I do not disagree with, absolutely. But under that guise of decency and dignity, then you're saying that the negotiators of trade that represent us generally should defer to a smaller group that can get to impose whatever floor they choose. So you're going to have, you're saying, fill the Trojan horse with what I want, not with what we're filling it. So I can understand, no, let me finish. I can understand you having a disagreement with some of the non-tariff things that go into it, but you're saying that they should be there. You would just define them differently. What I thought Jeff's point was interesting, because when he spoke to labor and elevating the labor standards or democratizing labor in Mexico, I don't know how you feel about that.
I can tell you.
I would imagine you generally support it.
Well, yes, but this was also
and
not.
So is that something that shouldn't be in the Trojan horse? Jeff suggests it shouldn't be, but you're saying that's okay to put that in there.
Actually, I think that
but let me finish. And so consequently, we're going to have feelings and attitudes about trade agreements. But if we can minimally start with a notion that trade is good and eliminating barriers to trade that expands jobs, growth, opportunity, and investment in markets that might not otherwise have it, that's good. Then how you regulate it within those markets, that's a different question about the sovereignty and the prerogatives of those governments in those countries. But we have to start with, how are we going to open up markets? Not we, the US, but we generally as a country to investment and democracy. And I think that's ultimately a healthy thing.
So markets are already open, right? So
how do you keep them open? And keep them open is through trade.
Right. So basically what I'm saying is you don't need the Trojan horse provisions to do that. That's what we're basically, right? So my argument is this: if we're going to have all the Trojan horse provisions in trade agreements, then we absolutely need simultaneously labor and environmental and consumer protection and food protection and all kinds of safety provisions. An alternative is we go back to a pre-NAFTA, pre-WTO model where trade is actually quotas and tariffs, and we do the labor stuff through the International Labor Organization, we do the environmental stuff through the 7 multilateral environmental agreements, which the new NAFTA has just wiped out, right?
There, I want to ask you a question. My understanding, reading of the labor chapter, is that they have, it really starts out with trying to meet the standards of the International Labor Organization. Right. To me, that should be the starting point for all this. And then on the environmental side.
And actually in Mexico, that was viewed as somewhat of an imposition. And you know what? There's probably a lot that needed to be done with respect to labor in Mexico. And in terms of democratizing the unions in Mexico, because actually the employees had very little say as to what their unions were entering into with companies, with corporations. Now, the negotiators of NAFTA weren't enamored with that because they thought essentially it would make them less competitive in terms of that being one of Mexico's competitive advantages, labor. And at the same time, I think the administration in the United States said, no, we want that, thinking, I think there was actually 2 motivations for that. One was political, making it a more attractive agreement, perhaps to get Democratic votes in the Congress. But I think there was actually a subtext there. I think the subtext was you have a president now, the 45th, who won with cobbling together kind of a non-traditional group of voters in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and said, maybe I can peel off some of those labor votes if I go in that direction. Maybe I can hang on to some of those labor voters, not Democratic congressmen, but labor voters in those states going into 2020. So while it seems to be kind of counter that this administration would push that sort of labor provision, and it was not embraced quickly by Mexico, there may have been a political subtext there that made some sense. I mean, again, I mean, sense in the political kind of context. And it's interesting. And you're right, maybe these kind of things shouldn't be imposed. Maybe that's sort of stepping into the area of another country's sovereignty, but that's kind of what happens with trade agreements.
So do you want me to address this issue?
So well, okay, one more point, then I'm gonna throw out another question.
So when we think of imposition, again, right, there's trade winners and trade losers. So actually a big contingent in Mexico, there's a whole sub-story to how so there's actually, there's a Mexico annex in the labor provisions in the new USMCA. And basically, the way that came about, or the way it came about according to the US press, is that the US was putting pressure on Mexico to do this. But what actually had been happening for the last 25, 30, 50 years is that, because one really important thing that you all should understand is Mexico has probably one of the best sets of labor laws on the planet, which is why, one of the reasons why we didn't end up with original NAFTA as a tri-national, for there to be a tri-national labor law. Because the Mexicans said, we don't want your crappy labor law. In Mexico, if there's a legal strike, and I actually wear, whenever I talk about NAFTA, my colors of black and red, which are the colors of a Mexican strike. When a strike happens legally in Mexico, the government, the factory has to shut down. There are no scab replacement workers allowed into that factory. There's mandatory profit sharing. Now, this doesn't happen very much in practice, but on paper, Mexico's labor law, it's part of the Mexican Constitution. It's fantastic, right? So in the context of this last 50 years, progressive Mexican organizations, labor unions, have been trying desperately to get the government to actually adhere to what is on that piece of paper. And so they were working, actually, having built original ties with US and Canadian unions to basically try to get this through. And so the reason, one of the big reasons the Mexico annex is there, because progressive Mexican labor activists and attorneys and human rights activists have been fighting for it, made sure it was in it, and recognized the opportunity that AMLO presented to be able to get this through, right? And so it is better, and mainly the reason it's better is because Mexican labor activists made it better, right?
So let me segue with that into positives, negatives, winners and losers of this new agreement. So how about if I start with you, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is when I hear in the press, first of all, the president says that NAFTA is the worst agreement of all time, and it's going to be replaced with the USMCA, which by implication is the greatest agreement of all time. I'll say two things. First of all, my own read of this, that going through, I mean, the first thing, and I'll stress this again, is that to go from the worst agreement to the best agreement, again, they're taking the major thread of it, which is the tariffs and the low tariffs, and keeping those all in place. So that, you know, the major foundation of a free trade agreement is there. I think a second, so it's more or less, well, there's no change there in that sense. It's the same agreement. Some tweaking is going on in terms of, we can say in terms of the enhancements, more chapters. There has been an update. And I'm going to mention shortly, I spent in November doing testimony before the International Trade Commission, before this was signed. And people embrace representatives of all kinds of industries, representatives of unions in the United States, representatives of environmental groups in the United States. They all had access. They were all listened to in terms of this testimony. They embraced that this was basically an upgrade. And that's where the term NAFTA 2.0 comes around. When you hear that term NAFTA 2.0, it's because it's basically an enhancement for the fact that over 25 years, you know, the digital economy has grown. Services as a share of not just our own economic activity, but services trade has grown, for which we have a surplus with Mexico in terms of the U.S. services exports. There's been a lot of growth in areas where these chapters have been brought in because of the developments in the economy over the last quarter century. So it's kind of tweaking in that regard. One thing also favorable about it is Tamara mentioned about the investor dispute settlement, that they are taking that away. So you mentioned about that. That is being taken
Not
away, which
completely,
is
but
is a good thing in going on the investment chapter. But let me kind of, the one other thing I want to say is in terms of this agreement, is sitting in on 2 days of testimony, listening to all of these representatives of various industries. I mean, I listened to like probably 50 people testify, and give and take where the International Trade Commission, which is 7 very highly qualified individuals, kind of hear and ask, and it's a give and take in terms of better understanding it. They are very much concerned about consumers in the United States, representing their interests, also representing firms' interests. So there is a balance there. And most of those comments really embraced of these industries that this was a minor change. And I can't tell you how frequently the term NAFTA 2.0 was raised across different industries in terms of the modification to this agreement and improvement of it. So it's a stark contrast, I think, in reality, that the U.S., first of all, as I said at the outset, I think eliminating NAFTA or not having USMCA would be very bad for the U.S. economy, for all of our economies, and would retrench us in terms of political stability and factors like that within North America. But basically, the USMCA is an enhancement, and it's nothing like how it's being characterized by the administration. But I think it's a fascinating thing that Robert Lighthizer is pushing through this agreement, which is basically, if you read it, very close to an enhancement and some improvements over NAFTA, and yet in stark contrast to his boss, who says it's something entirely different. It's absolutely
he's
fascinating.
the U.S. trade representative, probably.
Yes.
I guess I would echo to a point what Jeff said. I don't know that I would go as far as to say it's NAFTA 2.0. I would sort of be comfortable with the notion of NAFTA 1.5. In that I think that
I've also heard of 1.8.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of opportunity to have done more with the trade agreement and really, after 25 years, updated and really embraced just the breadth of the trade agreement, the breadth of the trade relationship that we have with Canada and Mexico here in the United States. Quite frankly, personally, I know that in the first trade agreement, the two sort of third rails that could not be touched were energy, and you've had some energy reform in Mexico, and immigration in terms of the movements of people. And I know it's not the stuff of trade perhaps, but I do think that we have to start leaning way into addressing the immigration challenges that we have in the United States. And we're long overdue for a broader look at comprehensive immigration reforms. I would have liked to see that. I think unlikely that you'll see that in a trade agreement, but I do think if you're going to be talking about the movement of capital, the movement of people, it should be part of that thinking as well. But I do think that a real opportunity for 2.0 was lost when we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that would have been the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and others. I guess 7, 8, 9 other countries. And that would have given us a real opportunity, not only in terms of trade, but I think in terms of geopolitical influence in regions that we are not as present as we need to be, vis-a-vis China, which has got, I think, given the nature of their governance, has got a much more strategic and ability to move strategically in directions that they want economically. And so I think the real opportunity was TPP. And so this is a bit better, but in my comments at the outset, I said, when a trade agreement that is hailed as the best ever on the street is largely met with simply relief that we got to this point, there was probably some opportunities squandered in the process.
Winners, losers?
Winners, losers? Well, the agreement actually does address China. So it prevents Canada and Mexico
Well, that it
from
does,
actually,
but that's not.
from actually engaging in trade agreements with non-market economies, which was really meant for China, right? This was the way that Trump, So trade winners and losers in this. I think that it's a mixed bag, but if they could tweak it, and this is what's being done now, is this massive effort by different organizations to improve it, as opposed to calling for, although the AFL-CIO this week actually said they wouldn't support it, but I think they're trying to apply more pressure to actually increase. So what's missing from these some of them improved labor situations is enforcement. And so the labor and environmental, what used to be part of side agreements.
Or under the agreement, or under the proposed new trade agreement?
Under the new trade agreement, we have some improvements in labor. The problem is that they're not enforceable at this point. So the way trade happens is there's this draft agreement, and now there's going to be implementing legislation. And that implementing legislation, sorry, I'm like Rain Man with trade, starts in the US House, because trade agreements are not treaties, which is why Congress has final say. They start in the House because they're technically a money bill. And so actually, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, and this is why I don't think we'll see this resolved before 2020, she has total control over whether this actually gets to the floor. She can also amend some of the implementing legislation. And she did this actually in May. There's called a May 10th, 2007 agreement, where President Bush had a bunch of free trade agreements with Colombia and other Korea. And basically, that was another time we had Democrats in Congress who basically pushed back against President Bush and said, no, you have to improve these trade agreements in various ways and increase the labor protections, et cetera, it included some environmental things. And so that's referred to as the May 10th agreement. There are certain things from the May 10th agreement that are going to carry over into the new USMCA. But if we want to sort of check off the list, you know, I think the Mexican annex is actually a fantastic thing if it goes through, which it probably will. It'll be a great thing for Mexican workers. The environmental provisions are problematic in a variety of ways because basically there's no mention of climate change at all. And the 7 multilateral environmental agreements basically do not enter into any kind of enforcement in this new version. So that's a problem for the environment. We get rid of ISDS for the most part between US and Canada. We get rid of 3 years. There's a time period in which this happens. In Mexico, we get rid of a lot of the ISDS except for certain sectors.
Can you explain ISDS?
These are the investor state dispute mechanisms, right?
Oh,
so
okay.
One of the things that Lighthizer hated about NAFTA but for a different reason than from progressive activists, he hated them from a sovereignty perspective, right? Because the US can get sued by other countries come to it from very different positions, but the result is the same. He doesn't want the ISDS mechanism.
And that's something you agree with, that it should go away.
Yes, absolutely. And then we have the other issue so what's going to become contentious for the progressive groups working on this, who have the ear of Lighthizer, because Lighthizer grew up in Ohio. He watched a ton of factories decimated in the Midwest, and so he comes to this from a very nationalistic, protectionist perspective. So he's pro-labor in that sense. And basically, he basically is going to, he's pushing for this elimination of ISDS, got it through, recognizes that in order for this to get through, there've got to be enforceable, meaningful enforceable reason. And the environmental organizations are just not as powerful, but the labor organizations are. So if we don't see the labor provisions increase, and actually they improved in terms of they're being based on ILO standards, but not the right ILO standards. So they're based on the ILO standards on the declarations of the rights at work, but they're not based on all of the ILO conventions, right, that cover labor protection. So there's still problems and issues. On the pharmaceutical issue, we've got pharmaceuticals are going to have a patent of 10 years. Currently in Mexico, there's 0%. In Canada, there's 0 years. In Canada, there's 8 years. And there's also this process of what they call evergreening. So evergreening means that you get an even longer patent if you change your little pill from a pink circle to an orange triangle. Even though the chemical in it doesn't change, you get an extra patent, right?
And is that good or bad?
That's a real problem. It's a problem for, right? The other issue, which no one talked about in NAFTA, is that part of this evergreening implies, it basically says that governments have to negotiate differently with pharmaceutical companies when they buy and procure medicines for their national healthcare system or for Medicaid or Medicare, right? So here again, we have an example of why is this in a trade agreement? Especially trade is supposed to be about getting rid of monopoly seeking, rent seeking, right? And what actually happens in a lot of these trade agreements is the corporations figure out ways of creating more of them.
And that
right?
is in the
right.
US.
The Canadian Bell, which is one of the 3 biggest Canadian telecoms, asked the Canadian government to negotiate in this new version of NAFTA that we would no longer be allowed to use VPN. Why is that in a trade agreement, right? VPN restrictions for all citizens of North America. It didn't succeed, but it was something that they wanted in the agreement. Go figure, right? So that's labor, environment, pharmaceutical. We have a sunset clause of 16 years, which means, I am really like Ray-Ban with this thing. 16 years, it can be reopened, right? We did not get rid of Buy American. So these are laws that would allow the US, when it procures certain kinds of products or services, to actually decide to, buy from US companies. So for example, the National Healthcare Service in Canada, they run a national healthcare service. They decide taxpayer dollars are going to be used to basically buy nurses' uniforms from a Canadian company. Can't do that. That violates trade rules, right? So all these examples of how governments are strapped in terms of their ability to actually create for the domestic good, right?
Audience questions, go ahead.
All right.
Oh, I'm sorry, did you
No,
want to?
I think we should take.
Okay.
Okay, so last year the Trump administration imposed 25% steel tariffs.
Could you start again?
Well, last year the Trump administration imposed 25% steel tariffs on Canada, even though that continues to hurt the U.S. And they cited national security as the reason. Now that the new negotiations have finished, the steel tariffs remain. So earlier this week, Christopher Freeland was talking a lot about how these tariffs remaining in place will be a large barrier to the ratification of the treaty in Canada. And I was wondering how far you all think that this will go or should go, because we share the world's largest border, we're like age-old allies, but to what extent should Canada allow itself to be pushed around by the U.S.? I know that Dr. Bergstrand, you were talking a lot about how Canadians would suffer the most earlier on. So should economics play a role?
Yeah, I would like to respond to that. And I'll tell you in the following context, which is at the ITC testimony, okay, which preceded the signing, and then we're waiting down in April for the economic analysis of the USMCA. A fascinating thing as you went from one testimony to the next across these industries, even though it was supposed to be, and they did talk about USMCA, I would say 85% of these representatives from the industries talked about the tariffs, the Section 232 tariffs. And that is the very first step, and that makes absolutely logical sense, right? Throwing on those tariffs on those industries and the impact that that has. It's raising costs. They provided evidence of how it's raising prices in the United States. And that was foremost, is the first thing you've got to address. I mean, that's like a precondition. It doesn't even make sense to do this thing if you have these tariffs way out of whack. So I thought that was fascinating to hear the consistency across them in arguing against those tariffs.
Yeah, I agree that I think that they're an obstacle to going forward with the agreements. I think they're a source of real heartburn in both Mexico and Canada the imposition of these tariffs. I also think that justifying them on the basis of national security was misplaced.
It's a total lie.
It's a total lie. If I can also make a kind of a
Fake news.
analogous, I also think that building a wall based on a national emergency declaration is not the case either. I don't think that was a security issue, and I don't think we have a national emergency at the border. I would also say, just to kind of take a moment to comment on your comments about the pharmaceuticals, the Canada Bell, and this host of issues. That you made some good points, but I also think the biggest point that you made to me was that the near impossibility of getting to a trade agreement if we open it up to each of the Congresses to discuss and negotiate, to have, 453 or whatever people that felt as passionately as you do about individual issues, and to multiply that by 3 would make getting to a trade agreement nearly impossible. Now, the kind of the halfway of that is the Trade Promotion Authority that says vote it up or down. You may be in love with 80% of it and hate 20% of it, but you're going to vote it up or down. And I actually think that that's sort of the way that you have to do these. Because if you don't, they become so politicized or so held hostage to the single issues of members that have very specific constituencies to address that you never get to the overall objective, which is trade with other countries in the world. And I think that's, I think it's fair criticism. Without criticizing the point you make, I think the process has to allow for some way to get to a trade agreement.
And I would agree that, I think we all agree, yay, about the tariffs, being problematic, being based on fake news, a lie. Also agree on this border wall issue, of course. And I would just say in response to that, though, again, then, and I think it is really difficult, and the reason Congress handed over authority for the negotiation of free trade, not just free trade agreements, but free trade, to the executive was actually because we saw in the 1930s, this kind of haggling about what I would want in this for my constituents, and then nothing gets done. My solution would be different, however. My solution would be get rid of the Trojan horse minions and just negotiate on the tariffs, the quotas, the subsidies, right? All the things, and get rid of, all the things that really kind of hamstring governments to legislate for the common good.
I'd just like to add one thing on that, which is, again, from an economic perspective. And I know where Tamara's coming from. Let's get rid of these distortions that are impeding free trade, make it a free trade agreement, rather than these things that become sovereign issue. But it's very subtle. And what a lot of trade economists have been working on the last decade is, and the World Bank measures this, it's what's called the fixed cost of exporting. For a company to simply start exporting in another country. And we tend to think about trade barriers as these variable trade costs, these tariffs, but actually some of the biggest impediments is just being able to start up all those regulations. The World Bank, and anybody can access this, the World Bank has something called the Cost of Doing Business Index. And it documents like hundreds of different kinds of regulations of that. So to the extent that we eliminated barriers, if the costs of international trade are really more in these fixed costs, and this is what I find in my study of free trade agreements, all there's like 600 free trade agreements in the world. And through the economic analysis, you can actually tease out that there's a big part of the impediment to trade from what it could be is because of these fixed costs. These start broaching some of these national issues, some of these regulatory issues, and it becomes a very gray issue. So, I mean, I know what you're saying. There's a certain clarity and lack of kind of, moving into these sovereignty issues, but they're almost unavoidable because of the complexity. We take pharmaceuticals, we take manufacturers, the multiple steps that go into producing high technology goods, and then if they get into biology issues and things like that, you cross these barriers, and they have to be addressed somehow. And that's why I think free trade agreements are better the way, because it's hard to do this with the 150 member nations in the WTO. You've got to do it in these small agreements where you can break down some of those barriers, and still at the same time, you have to respect the sovereignty.
And I guess I would say, they're 25 years old, so it happened. This is new, right?
So we have one more question, and then I'm going to wrap up. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, you have been addressing a lot of problems about sovereignty. So my question is, so what if instead of asking for less, we started asking for more, and if it was possible to actually have, or your views about it, to have not only big corporations to sit in the table of governance, but other social actors to like create a regional, more democratic organ of regulation. Not only because those are not, corporations are not only negotiating economic issues and tariffs, they are negotiating political institutions, right? So what if other non-state actors had the possibility also to be in that select group of the ones that are negotiating an agreement? And we can say that all that takes longer, but there is we have been in that region for hundreds of years, right? So I don't know if we can start thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it actually is more democratic than people seem to suggest. It isn't simply corporate America or corporate at the table. That's a nice talking point to rile up people, and sort of that's kind of the political point. But in the discussions, the very fact that you are talking and labor issues are at the fore and environmental issues are at the fore and non-governmental organizations are making us more aware of what's going on in emerging markets, and companies are more sensitive to the standards in the workplace and their emissions into the environment, is because it is more transparent. And so I get what you're saying, but I think there's been very real movement in that direction, certainly in the relatively short time that I've paid any attention at all to these things. And I'll say that's the last 2 years. I think there's been a lot of movement in that direction. Are they formally part of, quote, governance mechanisms? Probably less than you'd like and more than you realize through the advisories and different organisms, but probably less than you'd like. But I think there is input from what you would call broadly civil society, other than corporate and other than business. Excuse me, in government, other than government.
I would have a very different perspective of that. And you could read my book, Trade Battles, because I go into the history of how all this happened. And basically, the only reason we have any transparency is because these organizations demanded it during the NAFTA. They put up such a stink during the GATT and NAFTA negotiations, right? Because, they're, in terms of labor.
Yeah, but you're saying there is transparency now because they put up a battle. So you're still fighting yesterday's battle today. If there is transparency, you're saying it exists.
I'm saying there's modicum of transparency, a modicum. And in fact, what we've seen over time is that because these labor and environmental and consumer organizations push so hard, what happened after NAFTA is the government actually started to close down that transparency and participation. And so by the time we get to the Obama administration and the TPP negotiation, guess what he does? Mike Froman, the USTR under Obama, he classifies trade information. And he doesn't even classify it for all the organizations. He classifies it for members of Congress and says you only get to see this when we have a final document. So what I really document in the book, in the Trade Battles book, is the fact that, the problem with trade agreements and the way they're negotiated with very little transparency, with very little participation, right? We have no consumer rights groups on the ACPIN. We have 2 nominal environmental groups on the ACPIN. We have 600 corporations on the ACPIN, which is the advisory group, right? And so, and actually getting listened to, like when I actually interview all these people who have been trying from the civil society side to have their voices heard, ironically, what they say is, Lighthizer the first one to actually listen to us. What? The trade representative under the Republican crazy Trump, right? And so what I argue in the book, which I think is really an important takeaway, is that trade is a proxy for democracy. And so what we're doing with free trade agreements is we're severing economic policy from democratic practices in this country, and we're shipping it out to the rest of the world. So I would argue that yes, trade is hard, right? And having all these different provisions, so maybe if we actually did just go back to the trade stuff and not all these provisions, it would be easier to negotiate. But, you know, what we should be thinking about is actually how we can have a voice that actually represents all the different needs and interests. And I stress highly, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico and also in Canada. Did you want to add anything
I
to
would
that?
just add, and I don't know, we have fast track here in the United States legislature on this. I don't know what the rules are in Mexico and Canada in this regard, but in listening to this, and while I'm very supportive of democracy and the voice is heard, I do come back to, even here, we did, the Congress representing the people did pass fast track and saying we are willing to give up our individual inputs into this decision to be able to just yes or no vote, so there's a balance there, okay? And to actually get something done, at some point you have to yield some of that voice, which fast track does. I'd be curious to know how that is in Mexico in terms of the political process.
I don't believe they have a fast track mechanism per se, and it doesn't go through both House and Senate. But I can't tell you that exactly what the mechanism is.
The reason it was, well, yeah, it's a treaty.
For
Right.
us, it's a treaty. So
Right.
it
It's
passes
a treaty,
both
right? So it
Oh,
goes
that's
to,
okay.
right. And so the reason NAFTA was, the first NAFTA came to a head in the US is because of, the way that it goes through the Mexican and Canadian systems. It sort of didn't matter, right? So at the end, the British Columbia trade minister basically said something like, all bets are off. It's basically whatever happens in the US Congress, right? And so we're not going to see
The
in this
thing pending in
renegotiation
Mexico
much.
right now is the labor reform. That's the one thing that's still pending, and then you're right.
Yeah, and yesterday Morena passed a version of it which did not pass muster with most of the Mexican labor organizations. So it's a continuing battle. Yes, and the U.S. labor organizations.
So I would like to just ask a couple very simple questions to wrap up, to do the final. And the first is, because obviously we see how political and how politicized this is just from this discussion. But if I go back to just the regular Joe on the ground and the kind of simplistic talk that our president uses and how he got elected and what people care about, let me just ask you, so this agreement, or just sort of in summary, this agreement is just sort of a nudge forward from what I'm understanding from NAFTA, maybe has some improvements, still lacking, if I can do the balance of, what does it mean, or will there be any impact on the things that regular people care about, which is US jobs, Mexican wages, and consumer prices? Will this have any, it sounds like it won't have any impact on any of that at all, in terms of how the free trade is going to affect the things that are, are we going to lose more US jobs? Are we going to keep more US jobs? Will wages in Mexico be able to go up at all? Are our goods going to be cheaper, more expensive? What's the bottom line for the average guy like me with this this new agreement, if it passes?
Yeah, I just put a larger perspective. What matters for the average person, the average Jack, the average Jill, right? That it's all about standard of living and what we've observed in the United States, and I think the anti-free trade agreement, the anti-globalization, whether it's here, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in Poland, other industrialized countries, is about widening income inequality. And that widening income inequality is just enormous growth at the top end of the distribution. And if you look at the median real earnings for males in the United States since 1973, after inflation, has not changed, okay? Mean income's gone up because of the skewing distribution, but the median male worker in 40 years, 45 years, has not changed, okay? So there's stagnation there, there's frustration, there's the visibility of jobs changing. What matters in the end is education. In the end, standards of living grow over time. In the last 40 years, US standard of living grew fivefold, from $12,000 a year to $60,000 a year. In Mexico, it grew 4.4-fold, from about, I forget, it's at 18,000 now, grew from 4,000 on a purchasing power parity basis. So the important thing to take out is the standards of living do grow over time. Per capita income in Mexico has grown at a 3.7% annualized rate, okay? Is that because of trade? Is that because of NAFTA? NAFTA plays a very small role in this. That's because the workers have more capital per worker, stronger institutions, hopefully in Mexico than they were 40 years ago. Just technology grows, but technology growth tends to favor skilled workers and contributes to this widening income inequality. So you have to address at the lower end. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, you know, the NAFTA or USMCA, reasonable estimates for, say, Mexico, is that this will add 1% over the next 10 to 15 years to standard of living. The United States, 1/4 of 1% through passing that. That may seem really small, but never forget the power of compounding. The difference between earning 5% over your lifetime versus earning 5.5% can have an enormous effect in the long run on standards of living over a lifetime.
Does this new agreement, will it have any impact on the?
No, listen, I don't know that I could put it any better than Jeff. I think the answer to your questions was yes. I mean, I think there are benefits to consumers. There are jobs that are created, and there are people lifted out of poverty. Now, I think the second thing that we have to kind of be very realistic about is that there are people that are very pissed off, and for good reason. And it's the disparity in wealth and wages. And that's understandable. There's a sense that I got left out of this prosperity. And that's the one thing I think we've done poorly. This may not be a great example, but it gives you some sense. Walmart comes to a small town 20 years ago, and people celebrate because they are going to get things cheaper. But then they look around and a corner grocery is lost and a corner this is lost and small business in that community. That was a trade-off that people didn't think about. Now they may have bigger employment numbers when it's all said and done. And so it's kind of that Walmart thing is sort of a trade. Yeah, it's generally a net benefit, but maybe there's ways that we can address transitions from the corner grocery store, the corner butcher, the corner this to the big box. And I think that's kind of the analogy I use for these disparities in wealth and wages. So that has happened. But ultimately, I think, look, ultimately, it's very hard to argue against the benefits of opening up borders to the flow and movements of capital and people to the benefit of all who live within those regions. And I would put that under big D, democracy. And trade agreements may not be perfect, but they're steps in that direction.
So I agree with pretty much. I think the average person, why we should care is because there are ethical issues. I've talked about the ethical issues, but there's also these huge political consequences to not getting these things right. And so we see the political consequences in the US with an election where someone who's virulently racist who combines the anti-trade, right, with the racism against Mexicans and Mexico, right, wins an election. And so you talked about sort of tapping into that kind of angst and feeling left out by trade. And we see the same thing with Brexit. The same population kind of folks who feel left out from sort of the relationship that we have with the European Union. So I think there's political fallout. We should care about that. We should care for ethical reasons. And, you know, I think we would all agree, let me try to bring us all together, that, that basically, you know, opening borders and kind of trade is a good thing. Trade itself is a good thing. I mean, I was pushing for, you know, we should have a European Union style relationship with Mexico, right? I mean, that would be, for me, that would be open borders with Mexico would be the ethical thing. It would also eliminate a lot of these problems. It would actually eliminate a heck of a lot of these problems because most folks who come from Mexico actually don't want to stay. They want to be going back and forth, right? They want to be going home to their communities and families. Pardon?
No,
right?
Yeah.
So prior to, right, prior to some of these, you know, to closing the border in these kind of drastic ways, that's what we actually saw. You don't have the money to pay a coyote to take you across the border more than once, so you end up staying, right? So I think we should be thinking really progressively, despite the fact that we have this president who's virulently anti-immigration. I think the way to go is to be thinking really progressively on this and to be thinking about the alternative is actually, you know, to push open borders with Mexico, right? And more equality with Mexico and more relationships with Mexican organizations. One of the great outcomes of NAFTA, and I, you know, talk about this, you know, there's positives of NAFTA, unintended consequences, but the relationship between environmental organizations in the US and Mexico and Canada had a fantastic outcome for Mexican civil society. Mexico was like, oh, there's this thing called the Sierra Club. There's this thing called the Greenpeace. We need to start all these environmental organizations in Mexico. And they did. So, you know, I am definitely for creating more, not fewer relationships and kind of institutional infrastructures that we can solve some of these problems, but in a way that kind of, you know, again, what Jeff said, addresses the massive inequality, right? So we've had 25 years of free trade agreements and we still have massive inequality across. Now, again, that's not necessarily because of NAFTA, but NAFTA didn't prevent it, right? We still see it. And I think that is going to be the challenge of the next 50 years is, you know, how do we address this major global inequality? And how can we actually create trade agreements in ways that ethically and that, you know, efficiently really address some of these issues?
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. We're out of time, and I just want to say one question we didn't get to is whether it's going to pass, and it's probably not going to pass the US Congress. So
Not before the election.
It'll be close. Who could call it?
So thank you very much for coming. Promise to
You know
like
what,
the discussion.
I did, you know, I don't know that you could do this here, but I did something similar at another university. And I don't know that we could have had a more spirited conversation regardless, but at the other one, they had a bottle of tequila on the table, 4 shot glasses, and by the end of the conversation, it was nearly as
What
spirited
kind of
as-
tequila? What kind of tequila?
And a little of that's all I drank.
You should have let me know ahead of time.
So,
I could have arranged for that.
thank you.
That must
Yes,
have been
thank
in
you very
Texas.
much.
Huh? Yeah.
That must have been in Texas.
Yeah.